going to do that. And then Christina, if you'd like to get started, I'm going to share my screen with everyone, and I'm also going to keep everyone on mute until the end so that we can get through, just so we can get through in an uninterrupted fashion. I know you people are such talkers. When we get towards the end, we'll open it up for questions. Please feel free to message either of us, Christina or myself, and we will be happy to answer as we can or address whatever we can as we get through it. I'm also going to share my screen so that everybody can see some of the artwork that we're talking about. And finally, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's a beautiful Tuesday afternoon here in New York. I don't know where everybody's joining us from, but I hope it is as beautiful there, wherever you are. And I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully the car will stop honking. Okay.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Surrealism chat. It's, or as the proper title says, a visual language decoding surrealism and graffiti. And we are, we're just happy to have all of you join us today. And one second, just trying to, wait. Not sure what happened to my screen, sorry. Hold on one second, the slides. Are you, oh, you're sharing your screen. So hold on one second. I'm trying to organize myself here. Okay. Oh, no, there we go. Not exactly what I wanted. Okay, well, how can I, sorry, I know you're sharing the screen, but I just wanted to be able to have my visuals as well, but while looking at them, while I'm going through them. And
oh, Christina, hit escape. It'll take you out of the full screen.
Thank you so much. That makes it much easier. Okay. Well, let's get started. So, where to begin with surrealism? Surrealism was an artistic, intellectual, and literary movement that was started by André Breton in 1924. And it was started by him with a surrealist manifesto that he wrote as in response to sort of the challenges and horrors that everyone faced during World War I and World War II, and it was sort of a reaction against the movements that came before, which was symbolism and neoclassicism. He best described it as saying that the surrealists sought to overthrow the oppressive rules of modern society, revolting against the previous neoclassicism and war, and they began to demolish its backbone of thought, and in creating a super reality or surrealism. And in that, just in the term itself, kind of also shows and expresses how surrealism is the sort of the duality between fantasy and reality, and the idea of exploring the unconscious mind and being able to express itself through these depictions of unnerving illogical scenes created from everyday objects. And another famous quote from Breton would be to say, to resolve the previous contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, into one individual sort of space and realm. And it was also sort of exploring the psychology what's used, a term that's used in psychology, atomism, which is basically talking about how we have no control over certain actions. For example, nervousness, which I'm doing right now, sorry, breathing, and dreaming. And those three things basically talk about how the breathing and dreaming is one key thing that was explored by all of these artists that I'm going to be talking about today, much like Miro, Max Ernst, Mata, and Magritte, all focused on that. And then we have a few other works that we're going to be showing from Yves Tanguy and Dorothea Tanning. And then we can start by seeing this first work, which you have is a compare and contrast between a Max Ernst, that Max Ernst lithograph, which is, the title is Sharks Encircling in Search of a Victim. And that is a very severe and I would say horrific title. One does not want to be purchasing something that says that has such sort of an intense description just in the title, but at the same time, it's an interesting sort of exploration of how just aesthetically this work itself is almost soothing and simple in its, in just the simple lines and the movement. But at the same time, once knowing the title, you sort of see those three individual sharks coming towards the bottom of the page. And the idea that he also, what's great about this example too, is that he incorporated a movement that he himself started, which is called frottage. And it is the idea of rubbing against paper. And this sort of roughness that he would use a pencil and rub it against paper and create this texture. He would create this texture in the background, and it created for not only for depth, but also just the idea of his idea of movement as well. So we can go on to the next slide.
So I am going to talk a little bit now about Jean-Michel Basquiat, AKA Samo, and he comes out of a very similar, well, I guess let me back up a moment here. In the way that Christina and I wanted to discuss graffiti and surrealism in conjunction is that the two of them are both very exclusive and very insular practices. Surrealism was practiced by a very small group of people initially, begun in Paris, and it was a little bit like a group of friends who created art together and had discourse and dialogue, and a lot of interesting artistic things, cultural movements and things like that were sort of born out of that group. In a very similar manner, 30, 40 years later, graffiti was born in New York City. And it was born out of a real desire to remove itself, to remove artwork from this private kind of consumption that was available to a very select few people. Graffiti started popping up all over New York City, started out as tagging, which is this example here, Samo 1974, this tag that I have over in the corner, which is essentially people just scribbling their names on walls to mark that they had been there, to show to whomever might come by who was part of this, quote, indoctrinated mass of people who understood graffiti and tagging culture, that they had been there, to communicate with them. And it's a matter of prestige, it's a matter of confidence, it's a matter of secrecy. It's about belonging to a secret society that nobody else understands, that belongs exclusively to this group of people. So Jean-Michel Basquiat, this piece here is called Thyroid, and it's actually, it's not a graphitic piece, but it shows a lot of graphitic impulse, particularly with the way that he is showcasing, excuse me, my computer is just not cooperating. Okay, going back to Basquiat. We'll get the hang of this eventually, I'm sure. In any case, this piece here is super interesting because it combines the graphitic impulse of tagging and writing all over the place, and writing in places very inappropriate, because you can see this here in this sort of Grey's Anatomy type drawing of a person's neck, a thyroid gland, the bones that run through the neck, and all of that. And it's the same kind of impulse, because nobody was drawing words in their paintings. I mean, very few people were doing this at the time, and painting was very much considered something that belonged exclusively to figurative imagery. So people, places, historical paintings, or paintings that were landscapes, like the plein air and the Impressionism. If you're talking about the history of art, you've never found words in paintings or drawings or anything like that before. So Basquiat brings the graphitic impulse of scribbling to the fine art world, where he initially began, as I said, as Samo, which is an acronym for same old shit, and a character that he actually created so that he could be not only anonymous, but also a character that lived a different life on the streets. Samo, the character, made his living by selling a fake religion to his friends. So he, at one point, announced that Samo is dead through tagging, and then really began his fine art practice, which you see here with this piece here, and moved into a gallery world much more completely. But that's the kind of aspect of graffiti you find here, starting in a gallery context for one of the first times. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Who we got? Christina, all you.
Oh, we've got Dorothea Tanning. Okay, so and speaking of the secret language and also just the idea, going back to this idea of the duality, Dorothea Tanning, to give you some color, was an American artist who is famously known for being married to the fellow surrealist artist Max Ernst. And this example is a good example of how it shows that she was strongly influenced by him, because this work is from 1959, I believe, and they were married in 1946. So at this point, they'd been together for some time. And his sort of most famous work, Max Ernst's most famous work from 1932, was called Lop Lop, which was a figure of both man and bird together. And it was so significant to him because the fact that he himself as a child had a pet bird that passed away, and felt that his alter ego should be represented in this bird, Lop Lop. And so he would incorporate birds into a majority of his works. And therefore you can also see that Dorothea Tanning took that example from as well here. And what's sort of interesting is that when we're talking about this alter ego of the bird, it's a perfect example of how to explain what the artists at that time were thinking, that the idea that they were both exploring the realities and fantasy world, and like that they were exploring these ideas of having an alter ego and being able to escape the reality, the horrors of their reality at the present time. And what better example than to use a bird to symbolize escape. So that's all for this one.
I really love what you have. It appears to be a woman inside of a bird. Am I misreading that? It looks a little bit like there's a woman inside of this bird head.
Go further into that, yes, no, and most of as you'll see in the next example, it's the idea of both the mixed half bird, half woman, much like the Lop Lop again. And if you go to the next slide, we can see it in the next example of Dorothea Tanning, which is of the centered figure on the on the left. The example on the left, it's the figure in the center is also an example of what looks like half woman, half bird, standing in profile.
Okay.
And
okay, well, I don't want to get ahead of you. I just wanted to point out that I thought it was really interesting that she looks like she's dreaming inside of a bird's body. I love that. It's such a beautiful composition.
It's a striking composition, and it's interesting that it's all mostly blue, which seems to be incorporated into a lot of the surrealist work, specifically with Dorothea Tanning and Max Ernst's work in the backgrounds. And so in this piece, again, going just to finish on Dorothea Tanning here, that you'll see in the closer details, if we can get any closer, is that there is an eye and a nest of eggs at the bottom. So sort of to also just other small details that Dorothea wanted to incorporate into this idea of both exploring both the human characteristics as well as sort of characteristics that one would find with a bird, and the fact that the bird's nest, and you also see a sort of in the lower half of the figure, you see a lot of what look like feathers. And even in the background, one could say that those are just sort of a smattering of feathers in the background to again emphasize this idea of bird. So take it back to you, Alex.
It looks like a feathering, like when a bird is feathering their nest for eggs. Like this figure in the center looks like the bird has come home to nest, like on a macro scale, this little bitty nest in the bottom corner. What I was going to talk about, in addition to sort of this like feathery atmosphere, you also see the kind of conjunctionism abstraction there behind her, because it's not the main difference between figuration and abstraction is that one is in a readily readable body and the other is a depiction of something that has no readily readable imagery of any kind. So I really like the way she's juxtaposing these figuration pieces of this almost bird-like angel and or this angel-like bird, or vice versa, with this feathering of a nest almost. You have this piece next.
This one, oh, I think we missed one of yours, but
no, he comes.
Sorry.
He's there eventually. It's fine.
Well, we're changing things up here. So, well, it's another. This is work by Juan Miro, who I would say is probably one of the most significant 20th century modern masters. You could talk about him forever, and he was prolific with painting, and he was a master painter, drawer, lithograph artist. And so here is an example of the lithograph, that he did in, I believe it's 1939. I want to say, I can't see the exact date here, 1939. Which again, it's funny, it looks again like a disfigured body. It could, one wants to think it's either a human form or an animal form, perhaps another bird. But he was sort of fascinated. One thing that Miro was fascinated by and sort of inspired by were two trips that he did, one to the Netherlands and one to Paris in 1920. The trip to the Netherlands, where he studied the Dutch masters, he really started to understand not only exploring the idea of being able to paint interiors, but like the exploration of both painting humans and animals. And he wanted to take it a step further by incorporating this idea of what these travesties of war, where it was sort of creating these like almost grotesque, elongated, and what looked like slightly disfigured figures, and it's a little jarring at time to see, and seems a little displaced, but it's very for him, he's very meticulous in how he places it, and having, for example, that line, the horizontal line going right across, is finding a way to divide the plane of the composition, the two planes of the composition, and creating sort of a depth on something that seems very flat, and allowing us to sort of wonder as to, is the top the foreground and is the front is the bottom the background, or vice versa. And it's just sort of an interesting visual play that he really focused on throughout his career of work. I think the exploration of visibility was something he really showed across the board in every medium that he did. So.
All right. So to sort of spring off of that idea, I was going to go in a little bit about this character here. This is an artist whose name is Kaws, K-A-W-S. And Kaws is also born out of the graffiti street art tradition because Kaws is his tag. One day in the early 90s, he decided to begin tagging, and he was in high school and he was bored. So yes, tagging is very much part vandalistic impulse and bored teenagers, but another part of it is again, you know, provoking more of that language. Another part of that is really what is so important to the movement in general. You can see here this train that he did, and a lot of people moved out of streets as the movement sort of gained momentum. They moved from the streets to things like subway cars, especially in New York City. And the bigger the object, the greater the challenge, the greater the risk involved, the higher the prestige associated with it. So because it took you so long essentially to paint an entire subway car, which is enormous, you had to do it without being caught because you would be arrested, and you had to do it under cover of night in a train yard or something like that. And you had to do it relatively quickly. And the more of these you could pull off, the riskier you were, the more badass you were. And so on the whole, the more prestige you gained within the movement itself. So like Christina mentioned, that this is talking about the sort of response to the movements that came before, the response to external stimuli and culture. We can pretty much say that the entire history of art is a response to a movement or something that came before it. The Surrealism movement was sort of in response to the very pristine emergence of neoclassicism, which looks like Greek figures, paintings, sculptures, things that are very, very fine and very, very realistic. Graffiti has the same tendency to emerge from something that is very, very well established. If you think of pop art, and you know, you look over here at this picture, this figure, ankle bracelet, this picture by Kaws. This is Felix the cat. I'm not sure if anybody outside of myself, because I watch cartoons, is familiar with Felix the cat. I watch cartoons, and what we see here is sort of the response to pop culture, popular culture, being artists like, or not pop culture, excuse me, pop art, artists like Andy Warhol and Jasper Johns, who used everyday objects and gave them this real sort of mystical property because they were enshrining them in the context of artwork. And so here, something artwork that is generally prescribed for children. Kaws did get his start as a cartoonist, a painter for the 101 Dalmatians series on Disney, and later on Daria on MTV. He's responding to the fine art practice of abstract expressionism, which came around in the 40s and 50s, responding to pop art and Andy Warhol, who made millions and millions of dollars for taking a picture of Jackie O and not even painting it all, just taking the photograph of it and screen printing it onto a piece over and over again in different colors. And he's taking that and he's sort of poking fun at it. He's being satirical. He's bringing in his graffiti traditions, because you often saw characters like cartoons and on those subway cars. And you can see it happening here with Felix the cat. So that is one piece of his that I think is really fun. And then a second piece of his is a lot like Andy Warhol as well, in the sense that this is one image replicated 7 times. There's 7 separate images of this figure over here on the left, whose name is Chum. Chum is based on Michelin Man and Mickey Mouse. And he figures into a lot of, you see this kind of figure play into a lot of Kaws's work. Basically, he's subverting Mickey Mouse and turning him into something that's a little bit gruesome. He's a little bit scary. He's a little bit spooky. But like Andy Warhol, he takes this image and he repeats it over and over and over again in different colorways, in a way to really remove meaning from anything at all. All you see are shapes and colors, and they stop meaning anything or making sense to you in any way that you had ordinarily understood. So much like a rebellion against neoclassicism or the war or something like that, World War I, like Christina mentioned, World War II, these artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat and here Cause, who is a much later iteration of the form, are responding to and rebelling against this very ivory tower proper art world that you find that Andy Warhol was very much a part of, and subverting it, turning it on its head and making fun of it in a way that I find really, it makes me laugh. So I guess that's all that really matters to me about it. But I think that that's such an interesting way to make your work, is to do it in a way that says, I can do what you do and I can do it better. I think the next one is you, Christina. Yes.
Okay. Oh, well, so continuing on the conversation with in this example of Roberto Mata, 4am, it's actually quite fitting given the fact that we were just looking at Cause and talking about having to do things at odd hours of the night in order not to get caught. And this particular work was done and it's titled for saying during the dark hours, during the dark hours, I'm assuming, of the night. And it's also sort of a reflection on the dark time that they had been living with in Paris. Now, going backwards to Roberto Mata, to give you some explanation of Roberto Mata, he is a Chilean surrealist artist who was living in Paris at the time of Surrealism movement in the 20s and 30s, and was sort of an outcast among the surrealists, was not necessarily welcomed from the beginning. It was just sort of foreign, and has continued to stay, sort of, in my opinion, very undervalued for what he could be. But his idea here is an example of sort of focusing on eroticism, really, but it's in a way that is clearly not appealing. It's, I mean, these elongated bodies and figures that again seem sort of grotesque and delineated, and there's several phallic symbols that are going on in here, and that one thinks of sort of, there's the play between sexuality and also the idea of sort of, again, incorporating these horrors of war. But this is from 1975, and so he at that moment was doing an entire series, an entire body of work focusing on the themes of eroticism, orgies, and just different sort of sexual exploration. He too was part of the surrealist movement in the sense of doing a lot of drug experimentation and a lot of freedom sexually. So this is an example of probably what they were participating in at the time. And what else can I say about this piece? That's all for now. I mean, should we move on to the next one?
Well, actually, what I wanted to point out is this. I'm not really sure how to characterize it, other than like a drawing, I guess, of this figure. This sort of, it's sort of. I'm at a loss for words. It's got a round base. It almost looks like two arms coming up over here in this lighthouse type, or I consider it kind of lighthouse-like. And then it has this sort of key design on the top. That is what I was actually just going to talk about with Keith Haring, actually, and I only just noticed it now, so this is kind of an interesting discovery. But this sort of piece, this sort of code or symbol, fits really nicely into this piece by Keith Haring over here called Chocolate Buddha, which really, this piece is really a good example. I was going to say exemplary, but of the way that Keith Haring was using line. And it's so visually similar to this piece, this little teeny scribble over here in the side of this mata that I only just noticed. But it's a symbol that means something to somebody, and it actually kind of reminds me of cave paintings or cave drawings of a certain extent, which a lot of people could argue cave paintings are really the very first iteration of graffiti, because it's painting on a wall in a way that was not meant to have any kind of real lasting impact other than to document something like graffiti, like I was here. So
the cave drawings were communication too. I mean, that's basically what inspired it. And like to be able to, you know, the Indian populations were migrating from different locations, and they would document what they had done, or when they had been there, and they would move on, and that's what they would leave behind. So
and they were doing it in a way that it didn't matter what language you spoke, essentially. And this is really something that's very important to Keith Haring's artistic sensibility, is he can convey a message, an emotion, a story without needing to use words, which means that it's truly universal. Somebody who speaks Spanish, who speaks Japanese, who speaks Mandarin, and then Hindu and all of that, everybody can approach this image of somebody diving into I love how I'm trying to say that everybody can understand this, and I'm not really sure what he's diving into. Let's say an ocean, because there's a dolphin. But I mean, the image is the same to anybody across any of these cultures, and it's expressing a feeling of joy. This guy diving into an ocean with a dolphin, which is fun, it's playful, and it's easily and immediately understood by everybody, children, adults alike. It's immediately accessible, just like those cave painted images.
And I was also just going to comment, and maybe you disagree, but like also the idea of the color palette makes me want to think of pop art, of course, something
Definitely.
that is appealing and relatable. And and that's just one thing I would think of when I see it. But yes, you don't really know what you're getting into. Looks like bubblegum water.
It does. I mean, if you were to actually just deconstruct it and look at it in a real way, you're like, oh my God, these people are very sick. That's radioactive water. That dolphin is clearly going to eat this purple person. This is not a situation I want to be in. But I think if you look at it from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have any kind of information about art, doesn't know anything about it, and feels like they can't participate, this is the kind of accessible imagery that Keith Haring wanted to spread around the world and share with everyone. And this piece is entitled Pop Shop, which is actually what a storefront was called in New York City that he opened up in the mid-'80s, where he sold his artwork, therefore completely circumventing the artist gallery relationship and skipping out the middleman and leaving everything out there. So there was no premiums that were raised. There was never a gallerist cut or anything like that was involved in selling of artwork. And you could buy anything from a poster to a button to a jacket or a t-shirt that had these images on them. So art was really available for everybody. And that goes back to this very first page that I showed, where Keith Haring wanted to talk about how everybody has a right to be has a right to love art. Everybody has the right to participate with art. Everybody has the right to have art in their lives. And so when you talk about the accessibility of imagery, making it something that is instantly recognizable, here you see there's some, funny looking person in the back. At least it's a person, and it reads to you as a person. You have a hand over here, a fish. It reads to you as a fish, as a hand, and the message is not some convoluted commentary on the condition of the oceans at the moment or something like that. So that's why, one of the reasons why I really enjoy that piece in particular by Keith Haring. And then we can talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, but I'm going to let Christina step in with this guy.
Okay. Well, here we have Wilfredo Lam, The Reunion, and this piece is from 1973. Wilfredo Lam was also a surrealist artist. He was in Paris at the time, 1920s and 30s, but he was originally from Cuba. He's half Cuban, half African. Half Cuban, half Chinese, half African. Sorry. And he and what's interesting is that he himself as an individual and as an artist was exploring his own duality within himself, like what culture he really related to, and which one he would fit in with. And he never really felt like he fit in either in the African culture or within the Chinese culture. But here you sort of see small examples of where he incorporates that into the work itself, because the faces themselves on these figures, these sort of biomorphic figures, have what look like masks, African masks. And it's a small detail, slight indication of sort of those influences that he had. I mean, one would say that it's a reflection possibly on his influence by Picasso and Cubist period, but I mean, it also can be interpreted as part of like what he understood as part of his culture. I mean, he grew up believing in Santeria, which it's, you know, sort of a religious belief that, how can one describe it? I would think that it required a lot of rituals and a lot of performances outside in the woods, and being able to experience the other world. And so, and that definition kind of falls right into surrealism in itself, because he is using that as an example of showing how we are trying to, again, you know, bridge these two worlds of the fantasy and the realities. And he's, you know, he's sort of understanding it from that perspective, but also on a personal level, he's understanding it because he's grappled with it his whole life. And he too is another artist that I feel like is sort of undervalued in the sense of his, when it comes to being described as one of the surrealist artists. He's not the top name that one would think of, but I think he is a key sort of example of the movement. So.
That's so interesting because Santeria is so mystical. It's a lot like, I mean, when you really look at religion, you can say that a lot of it is about fantasy and reality. But rather than get political in this moment, Santeria is something that practices a lot of a ritual, like you said, a lot of, you know, like purifying rituals and protection rituals and things like that. And it's so interesting because a lot of people compare it to voodoo. So it has sort of some.
To say that because in some cases it's not, you know, it's not regarded as complimentary when saying voodoo, but you know, you can say that.
I'll say it. It's a little bit, people have talked about it like voodoo with that kind of ritualistic aspect to it. But I mean, it's religion. There's a lot of ritual involved in all religions. I mean, if you think about it, I can't really speak to Catholicism, but you know, if you think about a Passover Seder in Judaism and taking of the Eucharist in other Christian and Catholic religions, those kinds of things. Like, you know, some people believe they are eating the body of Christ, and over here in Santeria, they believe that leaving chicken bones or something like that in a specific context will imbue the subject with power. So I think that's super cool because these masks definitely give off a Santeria vibe. So, and this piece too, Chocolate Buddha that we were just talking about is essentially a mask, even though it's so much formalized that we're speaking. It's really about the formal consideration of drawing a line and the way that line connects to the next, to the next, to the next. What you see in the central part of this image is a mask. So that's really, and Keith was very highly influenced. He had a lot of Black friends, and he learned a lot of their culture as well from Africa. His one of his lovers, Juan Dubose, was actually Afro-Caribbean as well, and taught him a bit about the rituals and cultural aspects there. So he's responding to it in a way that is very definitive, but also very definitively Keith Haring. So I think that's a really cool comparison to draw with the two of them as well. I don't know who comes next. Oh, it's you. Okay.
This is a surprise to make sure we're staying on track here. This work, it's by Rene Magritte, who again, one of the surrealist artists. I think he's probably one of the better known surrealist artists from Belgium. He kind of, I mean, this is one example, but he, I would say, is known for taking the literal sense of this duality of every contrast that could exist, day and night, you know, like sky, earth, and just thinking of bad, good, bad. He was really exploring that line of being able to represent something that looks one way, but then in actuality isn't what it looks like. So it allows the viewer to sort of look at something and take, at first glance, have an impression of one thing, but in reality it's something completely different. Like he would have, you know, his more famous works were of a man with a bowler hat on and an apple in his mouth, and the idea that you're sort of not really sure who this man is and what exactly is happening in that particular moment, but he's talking about sort of the dreamlike state that he's in, and I'm trying to think of, sorry, I'm getting lost in thought here, that he's in a sort of experiencing a dreamlike state, but positioning it in reality. Much like this, the tree, he is talking about like it's an example of what looks like a castle or a high tower that is crumbling and almost looks decrepit and as if it's falling apart, as if it's been left behind after what looked like could have been a demolished area. And at the bottom, you see the roots of a tree expanding out within it, and so you wonder, is this an example? Is he saying a commentary on how the destruction of war sort of feeds into the earth and makes everyone else around it affected by it, or is it talking about how the war controlled and dictated the future and how everyone sort of lived their lives going forward? So it's kind of, it explores both those things. Yeah.
It reminds me of a keep in a castle, which is the, you know, castles were like complexes, and a keep was the central stronghold where you would send the royal family when there was trouble or something like that, and it was easily guarded. And those little teeny slits for windows are like where arrows were shot at. I have a lot of random thoughts that pop up like that. These two pieces are really fun because they're still Keith Haring's work, and you know, it's easy to see he has such an instantly recognizable smile. But these two pieces are called The Story of Red and Blue, and they're actually part of a book that Keith made, put together for children, in terms of the accessibility aspect that we were talking about, the principles of giving everybody art. Keith Haring was very, very interested in involving children in his artwork, and he often collaborated with them on a lot of New York City and California murals, which unfortunately most of them don't exist anymore because one of the inextricable pieces of graffiti and street art is that it is not meant to last. The ephemerality is as much a consideration of an artwork as the color, as the shape, the form, the line, all kinds of things here. But Keith wanted children because as much as what was happening in the 1980s, late 1980s, and as today, where arts are being defunded in the schools and in the classrooms, inner city children in New York were not being given any kind of arts education. So Keith put this book together to explain the relationship between colors, red and blue. And when you mix them, I don't have a blue example at the moment, but when you mix them, you create purple. So to explain to them color theory, very, very basic color theory, red and blue equal purple, to explain to them what this looks like and all of that, he put it together in the form of a children's storybook. And he created a story that, you see like what looks like one of the three little pigs over here on the left, who is this guy on the right is maybe Humpty Dumpty, maybe a very stoned Humpty Dumpty, we don't know. But the aspect that is truly so revolutionary here and so different than his forebears is the fact that he actively considered how to involve those populations that were not involved in art at all. Inner city children being a prime example of that. He was trying to figure out how to include them in this history, in this narrative. And it also speaks very much to his political, his stance as a political activist. There were no schools, there was no art in schools, apartheid was ending, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was underway, and Keith Haring not only utilized his imagery to stand up for these people, and here you see for children, I don't have an example of the AIDS thing, but he used it very much in a very public way that wasn't expressly meant for artworks purposes. So to see a banner where these images were included would be, again, something instantly readable and something available to the greater population as a whole. Let's see. And we actually have a question here I'm going to answer really fast because it is on topic. Linda asks, did the kids draw on the lithograph? Not these two in particular. This is not a piece that that Keith did with children. He did it for them. But there, that's that. That I don't know what I don't know where I was going with that. They didn't collaborate on this specific piece. Oops. Oh, good. Okay.
Okay. We can talk about both of those, the Roberto Mata and the Max Ernst at the same time. It's totally fine with me. This Roberto Mata, for you, I mean, we know that he's a true, I mentioned that he's a true Chilean surrealist, but he actually was trained as an architect in school, and he was actually sent to Paris to work under Le Corbusier, the architect. And while there, he met and familiarized himself with the surrealism movement. But this particular work just shows his, I mean, clearly his training in the idea of architecture and visualizing spaces. He was best known for what he called Inscapes, which were interior landscapes or interiors. And his idea is that he's doing here is he's sort of disrupting the visual space by creating what looks like an interior, but then also just breaking it apart completely and creating sort of this illogical space and completely new world, which is, again, going back to the whole idea of surrealism, where he's exploring, you know, both the internal and the external. And much like what we were talking about this the other day with Alex, but much like what the artists themselves were sort of struggling with their own personal psyche and understanding what what they were experiencing internally and what was happening externally. Like they were having to understand their sort of the process of both grieving and escapism. And I think that he indicates that in this sort of dreamlike state where everything looks like it's floating, and you see some biomorphic shapes sort of floating around. Like in the top corner, it almost looks like what could look like an angel with wings floating above. And then you have sort of these other, like what look like other pieces to what could be the interior of a room. There's two small, what look like windows in the bottom corner, or bottom, in the bottom, which is difficult to see, but the idea of the windows also just entering into this other world. And you see sort of this gesture of like what looks like an arm going sort of through that window. And then I can move on to the Max Ernst, this is a Max Ernst from 1950. And it's, again, Max Ernst was, at this time, he was already living in Arizona. In 1950, he had left Germany in 1940 to escape the war, and he actually escaped with Peggy Guggenheim, leaving his mistress at the time, Leonora Carrington, to go a little crazy, and he painted her in a portrait that's called The Duchess Who Lost Her Shoe. And it is an example of her just sort of losing her mind, both in this quintessential figure of both half woman, half bird. And at the bottom of this painting is a sort of a small portrait of Peggy Guggenheim coming up. And that's just a sort of an example of what he was experiencing before, what he did and what happened prior to this moment. He escaped all of that and ran off with Peggy Guggenheim to New York, and then ended up along the way meeting many other artists in New York, but moving to Arizona in 1950 and just incorporating, continuing to explore what he'd been exploring during the 30s and 40s with these, like, again, biomorphic shapes, and kind of creating this idea of the lines and creating texture in the background with his experimentation through frottage and grattage, which are two different movements, two different types of techniques. One with, as I mentioned before, the idea of rubbing pencil hard, like a sort of roughly against paper. And this is an example of that, where you see sort of the roughness in the background, which creates even more depth than one would have if it was just white background. So.
I'm sorry, did I misunderstand? Is Stephanie, why did I say that? Is Peggy Guggenheim in this piece?
What?
Or were you just talking about Peggy Guggenheim in general?
I was just talking about Max Ernst in general and sort of where his mindset was prior to this particular piece, because I feel like he is such, like many of the other artists we've mentioned, they're so prolific and they've had so many different movements that they've been involved in and iterations of their lives, that I think that Max Ernst it's key to understand that he escaped the war and ran off to the US with Peggy Guggenheim, who was saving grace, in order.
I was just going to say, if Peggy is in this piece, so she's not going to be too happy about the way that he represented her.
Well, I mean, I don't think he'd be too happy about the way he represented her in most pieces. I mean, they're never really flattering. Half bird, half man. I don't know many women that would want to look like a bird, but you know. But it's endearing. It's endearing. It's biographical. That's what I love about that particular piece that was done 10 years before this. So, yeah.
So now I'm going to open up our floor to some questions. I'm going to unmute everybody. Feel free to hop in. I'm going to stop sharing this. And stop. If anybody has any questions, any comments, et cetera, please feel free to hold on. I don't know what's happening here. Okay. Everybody's unmuted.
Not now. Am I on mute?
No. Hi, Linda.
Hi. Anyway, I went to Mexico a couple of years ago, and I think I saw Leonora, Carrington's work in a sculpture park. So she I don't know what year she did it, but it was huge bronzes. It was fabulous. And in Todos Santos area.
Yeah. Well, she's actually half Mexican, half English. And so she spent the remainder, once she was abandoned by Max Ernst in Germany, she ended up moving back to Mexico and living out the rest of her life there, and is considered to be one of the more significant surrealist painters from Mexico. So
yeah, it was phenomenal park. I loved it.
Yeah, no, they're beautiful pieces.
Yeah. So Ellen brings up a really interesting point. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Linda. Go ahead.
Well, it wasn't cutting me. I just didn't realize how successful she was. you know. And I didn't know she did all the sculptures and things.
What's the sad reality is that a lot of the surrealist women were sort of overlooked, and their associations were because of they were either involved with a fellow surrealist painter, or they themselves are now finally getting the recognition that they so deserved back then. But,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Well, she had a lot of money to do those bronzes, that's for sure. She had support.
I got that too. Any questions?
Okay, yes. So Ellen makes a really interesting point. She says that she is bummed when someone takes a photo of a street artist's work. The photo still belongs to the photographer, not the artist. And that is kind of a twofold issue because something that I didn't quite get into, but something that a lot of people argue, graffiti artists and non-graffiti artists alike, is the question of authenticity. We actually have a piece that's in, we have a viewing room that we invite you to join us in. We have a couple artists there that we didn't get a chance to speak about, but artists who practice both on the street and in the studio. And the question is, if and when a piece is created for the street, is it the same piece? Is it as authentic? Does it retain the aura, the mystery, the authenticity, et cetera, that it has when it's first created? Or when you remove it and you put it in a gallery context, does it lose all of those things? And because it doesn't have the original context it was created in on a street, is it in fact the same piece? Or is it even worth considering whether or not it's the same piece? Is it interesting in the way that it was on a street? And further to Alan's question is the fact that, as I mentioned before, street art, graffiti in general, is so ephemeral that really the only way to protect it, the only way to hold on to it and preserve it for posterity's sake, is to either A, take a photograph of it, which then, as Ellen mentioned, belongs to the photographer and not necessarily to the artist, the street artist, or B, to remove it from the street context, like we find with a lot of Banksys and things like that. Where they're actually physically chipped off of a wall and brought into a gallery space and made into a fine art piece. But it's so interesting now that, it's a consideration that a lot of graffiti artists have. And within their ranks, some will argue that if you're not drawing on the street, if you're not painting on the street, you're not actually a graffiti artist, even if you're emulating that style. Or if you have gone ahead and emulated that style and done it on the street, once you step into that gallery context, you lose that part of your aura. I don't really participate in that argument one way or another. I think it's really, really complex, and it's a really interesting argument to engage in. But when you have an artist who creates similar work on paper that they do on the street, how do you differentiate between the two? And I think that's probably one of the most interesting arguments about street art and graffiti in general. Like, does it belong in a gallery? Does it belong in a museum context? Or should it really just live on the street forever? Or until it has its own natural death kind of situation. So thank you for that. That's super interesting. Can we answer anybody else's questions?
Well, don't you think it's promotion when they do it on artists, when they do it on a building or something? It's like promotion,
Some of it, yeah, absolutely. And some of it is also to, like I mentioned earlier, to cut out the gallery kind of relationship and to, as a lot of artists know, galleries don't accept all of your work. Galleries don't accept all artists. Galleries have to be invested in whatever you want to do in order to show your work. So there are a lot of artists out there that don't get into galleries, that don't get to show their work in that kind of context. And so they think, fuck it, I'm just going to put it on the street so everybody can see it. Yeah. And, I'll make my own gallery kind of context. So I think, excuse my French, I think that has a lot to do with it as well. Maybe it's promotional. Maybe it's just, this is the only avenue that's available to me.
I think it's accessibility. As we mentioned before, I think that that's sort of the key aspect of their movement is accessibility and being able to, like what you were saying about the quote of Keith Haring, like about how art is for everyone and available to everyone. And there isn't the sense of elitism. And like by taking that away and like not having it accessible to everyone, then you're sort of removing their main goal of it. It's in a way. I mean, that's what I would argue.
Well,
I just found
I know. Linda, I was going to say, I know in LA and a lot of cities now they have rotating walls where they pick different artists to promote their work. They don't get paid to do the work, but it's all promotional and in good spots in the cities.
Okay.
Like I work with a curator who does that, and the artists aren't paid, but it's a good opportunity for graffiti artists to get or street artists to get their work out to the public.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, art should be everywhere, but it's not in the schools. You know, I certainly was a witness to that. It was desperate in the schools. But
yeah, it's a complicated, it's a complicated, multifaceted kind of argument to have, certainly.
I have a question about Mata and Ernst, and did they know each other? Were they friends? And Tamayo, and also it reminds me of Tamayo. Did they know each other? Were they like
Max Ernst and sorry, you were saying Mata, they did know each other. I mean, I feel like, the one artist, even though he doesn't fall under surrealism, but he probably would say he did if he were still living, as Pablo Picasso. And he seems to be the connection between a lot of these artists that they would come to Paris, and one of the first artists that they would meet is Pablo Picasso. But in the case of with Mata, yes, I would say that they did have a relationship. But again, like I mentioned before, Mata had kind of, I wouldn't say that he was well liked across the board. He was sort of considered a little bit of an outsider, and like he may have done something. I mean, he was a little promiscuous, and he may have done something that is still sort of up in the air and being questioned as to having had an affair with Gorky's wife. And then Gorky shortly thereafter actually committed suicide. And so there is rumored that Mata might have been cause of it, and a lot of people blame Mata for the death of Gorky. And that was one thing that, like, I mean, granted that happened later on, but I mean, it was along with the lines of him being a foreigner, not, being, should we say, like, well received, and then having sort of this promiscuous side and multiple affairs, and having no sort of boundaries in what he would do or explore. I think that also created some limitations with the relationship.
I just saw a film on Netflix about Gorky, Without Gorky, about his suicide, depression. It was his, I think his granddaughter, or it was his daughter. It was interesting.
The daughter, yeah.
And he had severe depression. I mean, it was like difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon for artists to suffer from depression. I would say these artists, at least the surrealist artists that I can think of, I love them because the fact that the more tormented the individual, the more appealing it is to study. And I think that they used their art exploration as an escape from their own lives, in the sense of they used alcohol, drugs, sex, everything as different outlets. That I mean, even artists in today's world will still be doing the same thing. It's just that at the time, it was very well known. Yeah.
But that Without Gorky, it's on now on Netflix.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Also, Tamayo. I mentioned Tamayo. It seems like a similar imagery.
Tamayo, there is some similarity. They didn't really know each other. But there is possible, because Tamayo did spend some time in Paris, and there's possible that he was influenced by them, but there's not a known direct correlation between them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that's it for us. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us for a little bit, talking about some graffiti and some surrealism. I popped the link that I was talking about to the viewing room in the chat over here, which appears on my right side of the screen. I don't know if that does on yours. In any case, look for the chat. If you'd like any more information from us, please feel free to pop an email into the same chat box, or if you received an email from us, send something to us to ask whatever questions or whatever. We so appreciate your coming and spending time with us. this afternoon.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to follow that up and say thank you for everyone for coming. And Alex, great job. And
Great job, Christina.
Sorry for the technical difficulties. We're still a work in progress here. Hopefully you guys were able to enjoy and understand a little bit of what we were talking about, and hopefully you'll be able to come back and listen to future talks that might be a little bit smoother in the future. But in the meantime, if you guys have any questions, feel free to email either Alex or I, and I've just put our information or email information in the chat. So let us know if you have any questions, or if you'd like to have a follow-up one-on-one and talk more about a specific work or specific period. I could talk about surrealism all day. So that's why.
And I could talk about graffiti even longer.
And it's really hard to be able to narrow down these modern masters into a few minutes. So I tried my best. Well,
everyone have a wonderful afternoon, evening, etc.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you. It was fun.